Okay. Can you hear me now? Ooh, that's loud. All right, here we go. I got to get all my props arranged. These are things I always forget to talk about. So now I get to show you about them. Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody here to an evening presentation of Solutions for a New Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project, a group of grassroots Albertans with no politicians at our table, committed to inspiring, advocating, and educating all Albertans on how we can achieve freedom and prosperity through independence. The Alberta Prosperity Project came from humble beginnings in an oil field shop in Nisku, Alberta. A group of like-minded individuals who had had enough of the ineffectiveness of our provincial government and who had had enough of the overreach from Ottawa, and they decided that enough was absolutely enough and it was time to take action. And thus, the Alberta Prosperity Project was born, and here we are. So I would like to invite Tanner Hnidey to open our event with a prayer.
We are often asked why we pray to commence our meetings, and the answer is because we recognize the supremacy of God. And prayer, we believe, is a recognition of that. So if you'd like to bow with me, we'll offer a quick word. Lord, I thank you so much for this day. I thank you for the sun and for the spring. To that end, we also pray for the farmers, that they would be blessed this season of seeding. Thank you for all of those who are able to join us today. I thank you for the volunteers and for the speakers that were able to travel here safely. I pray that you would give them wisdom as they speak, and that our event this evening would go according to your will. In the name of Christ, amen.
Thanks, Tanner. So my name's Shannon Packham, and I'm from Patricia, Alberta, which is near here, and I can tell you that I only got lost for a little while today. I was a teacher, but I have not been inside a classroom since the end of February of 2020, and it was then that I realized that if you don't stand for what is right, then you have to understand that you are part of what is wrong. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy." We are certainly experiencing such times today, and the Alberta Prosperity Project has great suggestions on how all Albertans can face these challenges more successfully and prosperously. I hope that our presence here not only encourages you and helps you to see the potential we have as a province, but also empowers you to share this fantastic message with your friends and neighbors. It's hard to grasp right at this moment, but I believe that there is something better for us. There's a better future for all of us just around the corner, and it starts right here today. After these presentations, you will be able to understand what is waiting for all of us and what we can all have. So this is how our events go. We've got guest speakers. Today we have 3 guest speakers, and then we'll have a question and answer period. So we have these little index cards like this on the chairs. If you think of something during one of the presentations and you want more clarity on that, just write it on the card, bring it to the gals at the back table over there, and then we will ask the questions after all the presentations are done. And I would also ask that you write in your very best penmanship, because there maybe would be a prize after that. I'm just kidding. So when you came in, you passed the membership table. We have memberships starting at $20, and we do count on memberships and donations, my second prop of the day, to keep this project moving around the province and spreading the message. So we appreciate anything that you can give. We also on this side have merchandise, and we count on the sales of the merchandise as well to help keep this project on the go. At the back of the room, when you came in the back doors, is where the bathrooms are. There's exits at the back. and the sides. Okay, so we are live streaming this event, so if you have a cell phone here, I would like to invite you to go to the Facebook page, the Alberta Prosperity Project. It's a dark blue background with gold letters. Find the live feed, tag a couple friends in it, and share it on your own page so that we can get the message out to more people. I would also like to give a big shout out to our volunteers. Without the volunteers, we wouldn't be able to have events in every community that we go to. These are people who believe in freedom and who are brave enough to take a stand to help their fellow Albertans. And without our volunteers, we wouldn't be here. So let's give them a hand. Okay, let's get started with our speakers. Our first speaker is an independent researcher and a writer. He is a columnist for the Western Standard, and he has a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors and a Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Calgary. He obtained his PhD in Political Science in the University of Alberta. His book, this one, Separatism, Then and Now, accounts how federal government policies have been designed to exploit the West, Alberta in particular. Most recently, he has been strongly advocating for Alberta independence. He boldly thrust the argument for independent Alberta into the limelight with another of his published works, No Other Option, Self-Determination for Alberta. He and his wife, Ivy, have 11 children and have been homeschooling for over 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, shedding some light on our independent journey, Mr. Michael Wagner.
Thank you for that introduction, Shannon. So tonight I want to talk about why Alberta needs to get out of Canada. And I'm going to talk about this from a historical perspective because I think it's easiest to understand why Alberta should get out of Canada when we look at Alberta's history. For Westerners, for a very long period of time, have felt that we've been exploited within Canada, and it's like this sense of exploitation has been building and building over time. The United States Declaration of Independence uses the phrase, a long train of abuses, to describe why the American colonies needed to declare their independence from the United States. And I think it's similar, that there's been a long train of abuses by the federal government towards Alberta that it justify why Alberta should become independent. Now, this part of Canada that we live in, the Canadian prairies, used to be part of Rupert's Land, which was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. And Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company and annexed it to Canada without consulting the people that lived here, because there were people that lived here already. You can think of the Red River Settlement in what's now Manitoba. There were thousands of people there, and they were not consulted. They were just added to Canada without being consulted, and that was one of the reasons why the first Riel Rebellion occurred. Now, after that, after this became part of Canada, of course, settlers were brought in to create an agricultural economy, but the farmers were at a disadvantage because there was a protective tariff, so that the farmers were forced basically to purchase their equipment from Ontario rather than getting less expensive equipment from the United States. So they had to pay higher prices for their equipment because of the protective tariff. And yet when they sold their grain, they had to sell it through middlemen. So they lost some of the price that way. And they also had to pay the transportation costs. So they lost money that way. So they were paying more for their stuff and getting less money for the grain than they would otherwise. Now, they didn't just sit back and take it. They fought back politically. And here in Alberta, Albertans rejected the mainstream political parties in the 1920s. They elected the United Farmers of Alberta government, and they also, at the federal level, they elected the Progressive Party of Canada. And of course, in those days, the word progressive means something different than it does today, so you don't have to be scared by that word, but Alberta was a strong supporter of the Progressive Party at the federal level. So Alberta rejected the mainstream parties, and especially this was shown when Alberta elected a social credit government in 1935 under Premier William Aberhart. Alberta was very different from the rest of the world in electing a social credit government. It was very unique, and it was international news that Alberta had done this. And Ted Byfield, the founder of Alberta Report magazine, wrote this about Alberta electing a social credit government. He said, "While other provinces whined about the Depression, Alberta acted. We would not acquiesce in the misery we felt and saw around us. We would fight. We would rebel. If anything is characteristic of this province, it's that spirit of defiance. Push us far enough and we will strike back. That was our record and that is our reputation." So Alberta... So Albertans were upset about their position within Canada, and they did fight back, but they didn't come to the point yet of seeing the need for independence. Now, the desire for independence, the threshold for seeing that need, was crossed when Pierre Trudeau became Prime Minister. When he became Prime Minister, of course, one of Pierre Trudeau's primary motivations for getting involved in politics was to make Quebec more at home within Canada. So the policies that he promoted were to make Quebec, feel more comfortable in Canada. And one of the first policies he brought in was the Official Languages Act to make French more prominent within Canada. And many people in the West felt that they were having French shoved down their throat. So that was kind of the initial impetus for being unhappy with Pierre Trudeau. Now, the first book on Western independence was written in 1971 and was called The Unfinished Revolt, Some Views on Western Independence. It was a collection of essays about Western independence. And what's most significant about this book, besides the fact that it was the first one, was the editors of this book were John Barr and Owen Anderson. And John Barr was the executive assistant for Alberta's Minister of Education. And Owen Anderson was the executive assistant to Premier Perry Strom at the time. So you had some influential people writing about this. Now, most of the essays were not in favor of Alberta independence, and the one that was most leaned that way was the essay by John Barr. And John Barr's idea was this. He said, first, we got to try and reform Canada, and if that doesn't work, then we need to become independent. Now, that was 1971, so it was 51 years ago when people started talking like that we need to reform Canada first. That's a long time, 51 years ago. So the idea was to give Canada one more chance and then become independent otherwise. So that was 1971. That was 2 years later when things really took off in terms of Alberta's conflict with Pierre Trudeau. In 1973, there was a war in the Middle East, and the price of oil skyrocketed. So now Alberta could really cash in on our resources. Those are our resources. Alberta owns the oil resources, and we could really cash in. But Trudeau didn't like that idea of Alberta cashing in. So for oil sold in Canada, he kept artificially the price low so that Alberta would not get a full price of oil when oil was sold within Canada. And also Alberta sold much oil to the United States. And he put an export tax on oil to the United States. So when Alberta sold oil to the United States, Eastern Canada or the federal government would get a whole bunch of that money. So Alberta would lose out whether the oil was sold within Canada or out of Canada. Alberta was not getting the full value for its resources. Of course, that made many Albertans really angry. And Peter Lougheed, who was our premier, fought back hard against Trudeau, not always successfully, but he did fight back to try and defend Alberta's interests in that conflict. So in 1979, there was a federal election, and Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives won a minority government. It was expected that this government would be favorable to Alberta because Joe Clark was from Alberta, but his government fell within a few months and really didn't do anything. What was important, though, was the federal election of 1980 after the fall of that minority government, because the Liberals deliberately ran their campaign against Alberta. And one of the Liberal campaign officials at the time, he didn't say this at the time, but he was an official at the time, he later said that their unofficial motto for that election campaign was "Screw the West, we'll take the rest." It was, normally within Canada, Canada's a big country. In any big country, you've got regions with differing interests. And normally a national leader would try and smooth over those differences in the interests of promoting national unity. The prime minister of the country wanted to promote national unity. But this was different because here for the first time was a prime minister exploiting regional differences, telling Eastern Canada that Alberta was the bad guy and he could put Alberta in his place if he gets reelected. And so he did get reelected with the support of, votes mostly in Quebec and Ontario. Of course, Albertans were very angry by him being reelected. And then he made things worse by bringing in the National Energy Program in November of 1980, at the end of October 1980. The National Energy Program, which basically was a federal government power grab to take control of Alberta's energy resources. Of course, Albertans were so angry that separatist movements began to arise. And in a by-election in 1982 in the Olds Didsbury constituency, the Western Canada Concept elected an MLA in a by-election. It was the first time a Western separatist had ever been elected. That showed how angry many Albertans were. Now, there's something also very significant about this period of time, that by bringing in the National Energy Program and attacking Alberta, Pierre Trudeau brought in a permanent change into Alberta's political culture. Before 1980, whenever there was surveys done about support for independence in Alberta, it was always in the single digits, like 4 or 5 or 6% support for independence. After 1980, all the surveys showed double-digit support for independence. The lowest ones I've seen were about 15 or 16%, in that early period. But usually when I take a survey on independence now, it's usually at least in the 20 or 25% figure or even higher. So that was a permanent change from 1980 onwards. Of course, Albertans did not like Pierre Trudeau. And if you want to talk about a fringe minority, people in Alberta who like Pierre Trudeau, that's a real fringe minority. But although many Albertans did want to become independent at that time, there were still other voices that were talking about reforming Canada. And one of the main voices then was Senator Ernest Manning. Like Ernest Manning had been Premier of Alberta. He was Alberta's longest serving Premier from 1943 to 1968. Then he was appointed to the Senate. And as a senator, he and two of his colleagues wrote a book in 1981 called Regional Representation, the Canadian Partnership. And they said that basically Canada's national institutions had to be reformed to allow for Western influence in Canadians' national institutions, or else the West would want to separate. And they proposed specifically Senate reform. So here in 1981, again, we have people saying, we need to reform Canada. We need those national institutions to represent the West's interests, or else we need to get out, or else people will want to get out. So this is a kind of a repeated theme throughout the last few decades. Of course, then finally in 1984, Pierre Trudeau resigned and John Turner became Prime Minister. There was an election in September and Brian Mulroney was elected as Prime Minister with the Progressive Conservative Party. You might remember that. So finally we got rid of the Liberal government and now everything was going to be okay, right? Because we got rid of the Liberals. Because every Alberta Member of Parliament was part of Brian Mulroney's government. And yet Brian Mulroney himself continued to favor Eastern Canada and Central Canada. In 1986, there was a competition as to which city would be best to maintain Canada's CF-18 fighter jets. And there was two cities in competition, Winnipeg and Montreal. There was like a formal competition criteria, and Winnipeg won based on that criteria. Winnipeg should get that CF-18 maintenance contract. But Brian Mulroney's government awarded the contract instead to Montreal, even though Montreal had lost. Because even under a Conservative government, there's always pressure on the federal government to favor Central Canada. That's where their votes are. So even when you get the Conservatives in, they still will favor Central Canada. Now, having a Conservative government is better for Alberta than having a Liberal government, but it's not a permanent solution. It's at best a Band-Aid solution because the Conservatives, even if they're elected for a brief period of time and they do something good for Alberta for a brief period of time, they will eventually lose an election to the Liberals and the Liberals will be back in. So the best that the Conservatives can offer us is a brief reprieve from the punishment we received from the Liberals. So the Conservative Party of Canada cannot be and is not a permanent solution to the problems that Alberta has within Canada. Now, as a result of what Brian Mulroney did, you probably remember the Reform Party came into existence. So many Westerners and Albertans were upset by the CF-18 issue that the Reform Party of Canada began to organize in 1987. Actually, I have a photocopy here of a brochure from 1987, a new federal political party to represent the West. Now, this brochure was put out by the Reform Association of Canada, which was the predecessor organization to the Reform Party being formed. I just want to read something from here because it's still applicable for today. So this is from 1987, and this is what they said. Throughout our history, Ontario and Quebec have held the lion's share of political influence in Canada, and they continue to dominate the national scene at the expense of the West. Our political and economic development is being hamstrung by the vested interests of the Golden Triangle establishment of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. The Western economy continues to languish, and Western influence in national economic and political decision-making is insufficient to bring about meaningful change. So that's 35 years ago, they said that the political influence of Ontario and Quebec is being exercised at the expense of the West. So after all these years, we still have the exact same position as they were experiencing back then. Also, a year later, a progressive Conservative member of Parliament named David Kilgour wrote an excellent book called Uneasy Patriots, Western Canadians in Confederation. So he was a member of Parliament from Edmonton, he was in Mulroney's government, and he wrote this. The time has come to address a long-standing injustice and bring the West into equal partnership with all other regions of the country. That's 1988, a year after this was done. So in 1988, he wrote, the time had come to address this long-standing injustice. And it did look like the time had come in 1988 because the Reform Party was taking off and getting lots of support in the West. The Reform Party, of course, wanted to create a Triple-E Senate, a Senate that would be elected, effective, and with equal representation from each province, because that would give Alberta some representation in the national government. That was one of their major policies. Of course, they didn't get to enact that policy. Over time, the Reform Party became more and more interested in winning a national government and less interested in Western issues. It converted itself into the Canadian Alliance and then joined with the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada and formed the Conservative Party of Canada. And of course, As that new party, they elected a Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. And many Albertans were happy with that government. Stephen Harper had been one of the founders of the Reform Party. He knew the West's concerns. And so as long as he was Prime Minister, for the most part, Albertans were happy with their place within Canada. But as you know, in 2015, Justin Trudeau defeated Stephen Harper in the federal election, and Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, and he immediately began to attack Alberta. He brought in policies such as Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, which makes it so much more difficult to get pipelines approved within Canada. And in fact, many people call it the No More Pipelines Bill, because with that law in place, there won't be new pipelines within Canada. He also brought in Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, which many people call the Alberta Tanker Ban, because it prevents any Alberta oil from being exported off the coast of British Columbia in tankers. So with these kinds of policies, Trudeau has basically subverted one aspect of the Constitution. Canada's Constitution gives provinces the ownership control of the resources, but Alberta is losing control of its natural resources through these kinds of laws that Trudeau has brought. Now, Trudeau also brought in a carbon tax, as you well know, and the Alberta government challenged that carbon tax at the Supreme Court level, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Justin Trudeau's law, his carbon tax law. But there was a few dissenting voices on the Supreme Court. One of them was from Alberta. He was opposed to the carbon tax, and he wrote that this carbon tax decision by the court, by the other judges, was opening the door to federal intrusion into all areas of provincial jurisdiction. So these kinds of laws that Trudeau is bringing in, by the Supreme Court supporting those laws, it helps Trudeau to get around the constitutional protection of provincial ownership of resources. And yet, even though as they are trying to shut down Alberta's oil industry or hamstring Alberta's oil industry because of their climate change agenda, they also still want the money from our oil industry. Of course, they want to take our money and shut down our economy at the same time. There was a well-known economist at the University of Calgary who has calculated, how much money Alberta has been sending to the federal government, and his calculation was that from 1965 until 2018. $630 billion have been transferred, a net transfer from Alberta to the federal government. But there is good news. As you'll remember, in 1995, there was a referendum in Quebec on independence that Quebec barely voted to stay within Canada. The federal government decided to create a reference case at the Supreme Court level. They were going to ask the Supreme Court whether Quebec could unilaterally secede from Canada if they won a referendum. And the court said, no, Quebec cannot unilaterally secede from Canada. However, if Quebec was to hold a referendum with a clear question on independence and a clear majority of people voted in favor of independence, then the federal government would have an obligation to negotiate Quebec's independence. Now, this was, of course, a court case dealing with Quebec, but the law applies to every province. So in making that ruling, the Supreme Court created a constitutional path for any province in Canada to leave Canada, according to constitutional law. So if Alberta was to hold a referendum on independence with a clear question and a clear majority voted in favor of independence, then Alberta could become independent itself. And that is the good news. Finally, I just want to conclude by saying I believe that independence is Alberta's only real solution. Like I mentioned John Barr in 1971 saying, well, let's reform Canada, and if we can't reform it, let's get out. That's 51 years ago. Then 10 years later, in 1981, Ernest Manning and his colleagues saying, if Canada doesn't reform its national institutions, then the West is going to want to become independent. That's 41 years ago. Then in 1988, 34 years ago, David Kilgour said, now is the time we need to make these changes, to rectify the injustices, 34 years ago. And then, of course, the Reform Party, and this is the best example. The Reform Party worked so hard. Alberta elected mostly Reform Party MPs in 1993 and 1997. We sent them to Ottawa to get the reforms that we needed so that we would feel wanted within Canada. Of course, the Reform Party's motto was the West wants in. That's why we sent our MPs there. And yet they too, for all their hard work, the Reform Party could not get the kind of changes that we need. So the message of the experience of the Reform Party is that Canada's political system cannot be fixed. We can learn from history, and we must learn from history. And the lesson of history that I've just described, the lesson is that Canada cannot be fixed. If Preston Manning and the Reform Party could not get a Triple E Senate and otherwise reform Canada's political system, then it can't be done. The West has tried to fix Canada, but it doesn't want to be fixed. Therefore, the only remaining alternative is to get out. If we keep asking Central Canada for a better deal for Alberta, they will just laugh at us. They keep laughing at us because they know they have the power and we don't. But if we hold a referendum and we vote for independence, they won't be laughing anymore. Now, you know, as I mentioned, Jason Kenney challenged the carbon tax at the Supreme Court, but Justin Trudeau won that one. And Jason Kenney, you know, held a referendum on equalization, and that didn't do anything either. Look, we've tried all these things over decades and decades. People have been talking about let's reform Canada, and some of them have been trying to reform Canada. And after 51 years, we know now what they did not know then is that Canada could not be fixed. You know, we can forgive John Barr for not knowing that Canada could not be fixed. That was 50 years ago, and we can forgive Ernest Manning for not knowing 40 years ago that Canada could not be fixed. And even David Kilgour 34 years ago, he didn't know Canada could not be fixed. They did not know that, but we know that now because we have all those years of experience to look to, so we can see from history that Canada cannot be fixed. So I think that Alberta needs to rekindle that spirit of defiance that Ted Byfield talked about and become an independent country. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Remember, if you need anything clarified, just write your question on the little index card and we'll ask it in a little bit. I forgot to mention that there is coffee and really good snacks at the back. I recommend the Nanaimo bars. The chocolate is super good. Okay, our next guest, a resident of Edmonton, educated over 17 years at the universities of McGill, Stanford, and the University of Alberta. He is recently retired 30-year heart and lung surgeon and critical care specialist. He is known as the North American pioneer of heart and lung transplants, implementing the first heart and lung transplantation program in Western Canada. The success of his programs grew to be the largest and most successful in Canada and one of the largest in North America. He has been recognized with numerous awards for excellence in medicine as well as community service. He is an exceptional community leader and a brilliant mind, and he has always advocated for the overall health and well-being of the people. He is a key driver of this project as our CEO, and on top of all of that, he is an individual who has had tremendous political influence in the eras of Premiers Getty, Klein, and Stelmach. He is here to talk to us today about Alberta's prosperity and freedom through independence. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Dennis Modry.
Got to have some place for my vodka. Just kidding. Well, thanks so much, folks, for coming out this afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many shiny faces with big smiles. I'm going to start off a little bit different today, and I know the staff is going to wonder where in the heck am I going with this, but I want to talk about vegetables for a second. And how many of you remember when George Bush Sr. once famously said that he hated broccoli? Personally, I like broccoli and Brussels sprouts and all that, but I don't know if you remember that. He said, "I'm the president, I don't like broccoli, and nobody can make me eat broccoli." Well, there was a poll in Canada recently, and the question that was posed was, what's the most hated vegetable in Canada? And it turned out the answer was Trudeau. So Lana and I were, some of you have heard this before, but we're driving into a large event in Medicine Hat. And I was a little short on petrol, so we pulled into the Shell and pulled up to the pump, and they didn't have a card reader in the pump, so I had to go inside. And behind this massive plexiglass window was the clerk, and I looked at him and I said, "Can I have $10,000 worth of gas in pump number 1? And he looked at me and he smiled. Actually, he didn't smile, come to think of it, he deadpanned. And he said, would that be regular or V-power? And it is true that it really is a pain in the gas right now, isn't it? And I said gas. Remember I said pain in the gas with this carbon tax. How many people here are pleased with the performance of our federal government? Please raise your hand. Nobody? How about the performance of the vegetable? All right. Well, it's interesting because in a January 4th Angus Reid survey that was reported that day, 73% of Albertans are disillusioned with the federal government, and the other 23% or 27% must be just disillusioned, period. But what about the performance of our provincial government? How many people are pleased with the performance of our provincial government? Raise your hand. Nobody. Surprising. What does it tell you, though? It tells you this: nobody's happy with government for a lot of reasons, right? It can be, and you have your own reasons why you're dissatisfied with government. Could it be corruption? Promises made but never kept? High taxes? Fiscal mismanagement? Frankly, lying to us? A fellow by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche once said, I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on I can't believe you. And isn't that the case with government these days? How many people here are concerned about their freedoms and prosperity? Right. Another Angus Reid survey reported on January the 12th of this year indicated that 87% of Albertans are concerned about the cost of living and inflation. So you're not alone. And just a few months prior, Jack Mintz, the chair of public policy at the University of Calgary, who's advised many governments over many years, stated, and this was posted in the Financial Post, which is a subsidiary of the National Post, that ending our oil and gas industry will result in a 1/3 reduction in the average income of Albertans. So there's no question we are facing in this province an existential threat to our very way of life, to our individual freedoms and rights, and to our economic well-being of each one of us if we do nothing. And it's not often that we know the future, but for those of you who have bothered to look at what's coming down the line with respect to the Great Reset, that dystopian future, that Orwellian future, is looming large, and it's not very far away. But I'm here to tell you today that, ladies and gentlemen, if we come together for common cause and do something amazing, something that's never been done before, the future can be incredibly brilliant. And what is that we can do? Before we get there, I want to touch on the dilemma that we're in right now in a couple of areas. One is in the area of our individual freedoms. And by the way, the truckers fought for our freedoms. And so for any of you out there who are truckers, thank you. And also prosperity. That pump jack represents prosperity in this province. But let's talk about, just for a second, our individual freedoms, or our freedoms. How many people here would like freedom from being overgoverned, overregulated, and overtaxed? How about freedom from wokeness, cancel culture, critical race theory? See, this is an exercise program. Don't forget, you got 2 arms. And what about freedom from the Great Reset? We'll talk about that in a bit. And I think I know where you feel about, or how you feel about corruption. But look at the freedoms that we've lost. We've lost freedom of speech. You can't have an intelligent conversation with someone who has a diametrically opposite perspective because you get accused of being a racist. And what about freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of assembly? We've seen how these rights can be so easily abrogated by government. And what about freedom of travel? Well, we still don't have freedom of travel, or many of us don't. And what about freedom of the family to be the moral, culture, and spiritual pillar of society, to pass on values, principles, critical thinking, work ethic, responsibility, accountability to future generations? That's been usurped, hasn't it, by the school system. That needs to come back to us. How many of you have heard about the new name for Mother's Day? For those of you who didn't see the elementary school in British Columbia, they wanted to rename Mother's Day Grown Ups Who Love You Day. I can only imagine what they're going to say about Father's Day. Sperm Day. And what about, just for a moment, I just want to get back to freedom of movement. In relation to, actually I'll do it a little bit differently. Let me just highlight a couple of points about the Great Reset. So for those of you who know about it, let me just capsulize it for you. So it's a highly influential movement, the Great Reset, by the global elites of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, under a contract between the two organizations called Agenda 2030. And it is to reset the global economy and restructure the very fabric of society, how we function, using banks, governance agencies, and as well, environmental, government, and social metrics to control billions of people for everything that you do, everything that you buy, every place that you go. So for those who think it's a conspiracy theory, and in the beginning, I have to admit, I thought it was a conspiracy theory as well. But it obviously is not a conspiracy theory, it's actually fact. Because it's being talked about, and we can trust them, can't we? The media. Well, not really, but if you go to the website, it's all there. And a little bit of evidence is, the first part of it is the digital ID. So the digital ID is being rolled out. Following that, there's going to be the digital currency. And we've seen how easily the banks have been instructed by government to freeze accounts. And then following that, you'll have a social credit score based on your environmental, government, and social willingness to follow government edicts. So in essence, the Great Reset will function this way. You will be pinned, cataloged, categorized, tracked, and controlled in everything that you do. And as Klaus Schwab has said, you will own nothing and be happy. And that is the intention, to create two stratas of society, the super global elites and everybody else. Please raise your hand if that's a dystopian future that you'd like to embrace. I didn't think so. Most people, most reasonable people would never embrace that kind of an attitude, unless you want government to control everything that you do. And there are some people like that. Well, let's consider the issue of prosperity for a second. And I'm going to touch on prosperity in two areas. One, our oil industry, and Michael has done a good job outlining a couple of things, and as well, confiscatory taxation. So you all know, you live in oil country around this area as well, and you know that we have the third largest oil resource in the world, and 97 to 98% of all the oil reserves known in Canada exist right here in this province. But you know as well that by 2030, the federal government wants to reduce our energy output by 42%, our oil output by 42%, and phase it out altogether, either prior to or at the latest by 2050. And I already told you what Jack Mintz said about reducing the average income in the province of Alberta. So you can think about what that's going to do to your quality of life. Now, we're vilified in this province because of our oil industry by the eco-alarmists and the environmentalists, very unjustifiably. What they never recognize, for example, is that there's CO2 produced, but there's also CO2 taken up by our 320 billion trees, muskeg, and agricultural lands. And there are some climate scientists who feel as though Canada is actually CO2 negative. By the way, and you all know that CO2 is plant food. The higher the CO2 levels, the more plant growth occurs. And one of the things that the environmentalists, and we're all environmentalists, but I'm talking about the environmentalists that really want to shut down the energy industry based on CO2. And by the way, at one time, our CO2 levels right now are about 420 parts per million in the atmosphere, but many centuries ago, according to the scientists, it was over 5,000 parts per million. So we're nowhere near what the highest levels of CO2 have been at one time in the future. Volcanoes would do a tremendous job in increasing CO2 production. If we ended all energy, all carbon output in Canada, it would make zero difference on CO2 in the atmosphere, because we only produce 0.15% of the CO2 production. But one of the things that I find interesting is that we hear all of this alarmist dialogue, nattering nabobs of negativism from the environmentalists about apocalyptic events that are going to occur. Since 1864, the first mention of concerns regarding the climate due to man-made activity, since 1864, over 100 apocalyptic predictions have been made, and guess how many have come true? Absolutely none. So it reminds me of that song, "When Will They Ever Learn?" Apparently never. So one of the things that has also bugged me lately has been the Allen Report. I don't know if many of you know what the Allen Report is, but raise your hand if you know, if you've heard of it. So a couple of you have. But for those of you who don't know what the Allen Report is, Steve Allen is a forensic accountant, and he was commissioned by the provincial government to look at foreign spending to impact negatively the development and transport of our natural resources in this province. Between 2003 and 2019, $1.3 billion was spent on advertising, negative advertising, blockades, everything that the NGOs and environmental organizations could do to shutter the development and transport of our natural resources. They lobbied government, they lobbied the energy industries, et cetera, et cetera. And where did this money come from? Well, much of it did come from the federal government, but the majority came from competitive countries around the world and competitive energy industries around the world to these various non-government organizations to adversely affect our economy and your standard of living. Now, so with that, I want you to think about when you're talking to people who really have bought into the narrative of the climate arguments, climate change arguments, ask them if they know how many products emanate from a barrel of oil, because it's over 6,000. We'd literally go back to the Stone Age without the oil and gas industry. And you can take, for example, a gas plant or a coal plant sitting on 4 acres of property. And not too far from here, you know, there's that big wind farm. But to produce the same amount of energy from one gas plant or one coal plant that sits on 4 acres of property, by a wind farm, you need to put wind turbines on 2,400 acres, 2,400 acres. So how is that ecologically sensible? Particularly when you understand that the fans come from the oil industry. In fact, every product that goes into the development of solar panels and wind farms comes from the oil industry. So, I mean, it's really bizarre to think that, you know, we're going to end our oil and gas industry, or the federal government's going to end our oil and gas industry. Now, sure, there's other energy expectations that are coming, nuclear, for example, micronuclear that don't melt down and that sort of thing. But we're going to need our oil industry, not just for energy, but for all of those 6,000 products that I talked about earlier. Now, let me just touch on confiscatory taxation for a second. How many people here know that every year some $55 to $60 billion of federal taxes leaves this province, of which we get back 25 to 27 billion depending on the year? And how many of you know that we overfund our pension plan by $3 billion a year? And as Michael pointed out, at least 630 billion, and it's probably closer to 700 billion now, since 1965, has been transferred from Alberta to Ottawa to be redistributed to virtue signaling causes that we have no input on as Albertans. And of that money, we got back zero, not a cent. So the question is then, ladies and gentlemen, we look at the carbon tax, we look at the Great Reset coming. What are we to do about this? What are our options? Well, there are three. One is we can do nothing. And doing nothing, to me, is in essence, consider yourself, or consider Alberta a canoe on the Niagara River, and you're the inhabitants of that canoe. And you know which way that canoe is going. And eventually you're going to hear the rush of the falls. At some point, you still have an opportunity to paddle like crazy to shore. At another point, you're going over the falls into the abyss of the hell of the Great Reset. That's where we're going if we do nothing. So what are our other two options? Well, they're both independence options. And the first one is independence within Canada. In other words, Alberta taking control of its wealth and its programs, unfettered by Ottawa. And the other is Alberta takes control of all of its affairs and wealth, also unfettered by Ottawa, but it becomes an independent, sovereign, constitutional republic. Now, how many people here, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, how many people here would prefer that Alberta remain in Canada, but have control of its wealth and its affairs? Just raise your hand. Okay, there's a few. There's a few. We're Canada on your heart, and that's good. And how many people would prefer that Alberta get out of Dodge? Okay, thank you. That's pretty much the response that we see everywhere. Sometimes there might be a few more people that would like Alberta to remain in Confederation, but with a better deal. And I think it's really important for all of you, not just the people who want Alberta to remain in Confederation, but for those who want Alberta to become an independent sovereign nation, to understand the difficulty of fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation. And Michael has already mentioned some of it. I'm going to put a fine point on some key issues relating to this, because this is the key issue. Alberta stays in Canada or Alberta doesn't stay in Canada. So let's look at fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation. And as you know, we had an equalization referendum. 62% of Albertans voted to end it. Let's look at ending equalization as a metaphor for fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation, for ending any egregious program in Canada that harms Alberta's interests. And we're going to look at ending equalization through the lens, very briefly, of history, the structural electoral imbalance, and Michael touched on it a bit, but I want to put sharp point on that as well. And where the rubber meets the road is in the 5 constitutional hurdles. So very briefly, history. I don't know if you knew that the fix was in 1904. Now, Alberta became a province incorporated into Canada September 1, 1905, thanks to the efforts of Sir Clifford Sifton, the Minister of Interior in the Liberal government of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And what he said in 1904 is very prescient. It's important to understand what he said because it dovetails with what Michael said. But the fix was in 1904 when Clifford Sifton said these words, and I quote, "We desire, and all Canadian patriots desire." And when he refers to Canadian patriots, he's referring to those people who live in the regions of Quebec and Ontario. So we desire, and all Canadian patriots desire, that the great trade of the prairies is Alberta's wealth, that the great trade of the prairies shall go to enrich our people in the East, to build up our factories and our places of work, and in every legitimate way contribute to our prosperity. Now, you can see how prescient that statement is, because we started as a colony to serve the interests of the East on September 1, 1905. 116 years later, we're still a colony serving the interests of the East. And for 116 years, we've been pillaged and plundered for the benefit of the East at our expense. And one of the most maddening things to understand, even though some premiers like Premier Lougheed tried to fight the good fight with Ottawa, not one federal government and not one provincial government has ever been able to protect Alberta's interests, prosperity, or self-determination. You have to really understand that little bit of history. Now, when you're talking to people about fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation, you can then have a little bit of understanding about history. And if you think that you can still, understanding history, that you can still end equalization, let's move on to the electoral imbalance. Very briefly, we do not have representation by population, and as Michael alluded to, it does not matter a bit. Why? Because every federal election will be decided by voter-rich Quebec and Ontario, and it doesn't matter the party in power, be it Liberal or Conservative, in order to be elected and in order to remain in power, you need to pander to the wishes of Quebec and Ontario at Alberta's expense. Now, you know history, you know a little bit about the electoral imbalance, and let's look at the 5 constitutional hurdles. Like I said, that's where the rubber meets the road. So if we wanted to end equalization, and Jason Kenney has an opportunity, he's got this mandate from Alberta, let's look at how difficult it would be to do that. So he goes to Ottawa, and what has to happen, number one, is the House of Commons has to vote in favor of opening the Constitution and changing it to benefit Alberta. Number two, the Senate has to ratify that vote as well. So in other words, the Senate has to have a majority vote in favor of Alberta. Number three, 7 of 10 provincial legislatures representing 50% of the population also have to vote in favor of ending equalization or any other egregious program that harms Alberta's interests. And how do you think Quebec would vote? And number 4, Quebec believes that it has a veto, even though it never signed the 1982 Constitution. Isn't that interesting? And they just demonstrated last week they do have a veto. You know what they did? They passed in the Quebec legislature Bill 96, and that abrogates a constitutional or a component in the Constitution that gives minority that assures minority language rights. So they've eliminated that against the Constitution. It goes to show you they do have control. And what's the fifth hurdle to change the Constitution? It's the Supreme Court itself. There are 9 justices in the Supreme Court. They're all appointed out of the Prime Minister's office. 3 come from Quebec, 3 come from Ontario, 1 from the Maritimes, and 2 from all of Western Canada. So how do you think a constitutional battle would play out? In Alberta's interest or in Eastern Canada's interest? I think you know the answer. And if you want a little bit of evidence to that answer, let's look at how the Supreme Court ruled in relation to the carbon tax. They had to twist themselves into a darn pretzel in order to approve that carbon tax, which is against the provincial constitutional rights to develop and transport its own natural resources. So this is the way the Supreme Court operates. That's the 5th hurdle. Now, one more piece of evidence for you to consider in terms of fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation, and there have been 2 attempts to change the Constitution in the past. One was Meech Lake, and the other was the Charlottetown Accord, and they both failed. So what does that mean? It means, ladies and gentlemen, simply this: it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, and if after 116 years it hasn't been done, changing the Constitution is just a hill or a mountain too high to climb. So what's the alternative? As Michael pointed out, the Supreme Court has ruled that provinces can leave Canada, so therefore there's the potential for Alberta to become an independent sovereign nation. Is that possible right now? No, it's not possible. Not yet. But you people can make it possible. You people, in fact, can make Alberta stay in Confederation with everything that Alberta wants: self-determination, looking after all its own affairs and its own wealth, or Alberta becoming a new sovereign constitutional republic. And this is where those 2 paradigms come together. This is why Albertans who want a better deal and Albertans who want Alberta to get out of Dodge need to come together around this one thing: leverage. Alberta does not have leverage. Alberta cannot chart a new path forward within Confederation or untethered to Canada. But the leverage that you people can provide is a successful referendum on independence, because that gives Alberta the moral and legal legitimacy to chart a new path forward. The moral and legal legitimacy to go to Ottawa and say, this is what we want. And here's the way it would work. 2023, you elect an independence-focused government. That government then implements new legislation called the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And what that legislation does is it accelerates the process of taking control of that which it can within the Constitution: policing, pensions, immigration, employment insurance, and provincial tax collection, which also sets the stage for taking control of federal tax collection, because that's where we really have leverage. When you take control of the wealth, as you know, he who has the gold rules. So if we have our own gold, we rule. But, so you take control of everything that I just said, not yet federal tax collection, and then you have a successful referendum on independence. That can occur 24 to 30 months after the 2023 election, or before even. Then, Alberta government negotiates for 6 to 12 months with the federal government and the other provinces. And if Alberta doesn't get what it wants, then Alberta becomes an independent sovereign nation. And ladies and gentlemen, it's really that simple. It's not complicated. And so don't let people frighten you into thinking that this is impossible. and that there are many different hurdles that we have to get through. That fundamentally is the solution, and it's really that simple. Now, what is Alberta Prosperity Project then all about in terms of trying to achieve this? Well, here it is. In order to influence the outcome of the 2023 election, our intention is to grow the membership of the Alberta Prosperity Project to 500,000 to 1 million or more people. And why is that important? Well, it's important because of what has been defined as the 3.5% rule. It was coined actually by Erica Chenoweth, a Harvard professor. She studied societal movements over a couple of hundred years, and what she determined was that just 3.5% of a population can change the direction of that society. Just 3.5%. When Jason Kenney was elected and the UCP were elected, they had 120,000 members. That's 3.5% of the voting electorate in Alberta. So 500,000 to 1 million is 15 to 30% of the population in Alberta. So we would control the outcome of the election. Why do we know that? Well, because as Ralph Klein used to say, love that guy, what Ralph used to say is he'd say, find a parade and get in front of it. So we're creating that movement. We're creating that parade that the UCP want to get in front of. The Wild Rose Independence Party wants to get in front of. The Independence Party of Alberta wants to get in front of. The Alberta Advantage Party wants to get in front of. And perhaps the Buffalo Party as well. Not so sure about the NDP. But maybe them as well, who knows. And by the way, there are many NDP supporters that are supporting what we're doing because they want prosperity as well. Now, in addition to growing the membership, how are we going to do that? Well, one of them is having events like this. We're also using these events to build up chapters, educational chapters throughout the province. And it's remarkable how many chapters. I thought we'd maybe have 80 or 90 chapters set up through the balance of the year, but we're well over 120 or 30 chapters already, and many more volunteer chapter leaders are coming up. And Shannon will tell you more about the chapters in a minute. In addition to that, we've engaged with an international marketing company to work with us on getting the message out, getting the educational material out. We've just, and I'm really proud of Walter's in the back there, he's our VP of communications, and he's an absolute IT wizard, and working with our international marketing and advertising company, we've redone the website. It just rolled out today. I'm very proud of it. It's going to even improve further, but you might want to have a look at it and see what's there. In addition to these chapters that we're talking about, I have a feeling that we're going to have 300, maybe 400 chapters set up through the balance of this year. And each chapter's responsibility is to educate people in that area and to get members of the Alberta Prosperity Project. And it's working unbelievably well. So along with that, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about the future as well. The prizes for independence are spectacular. You take the pensioners, massive improvement in pensions, taxation, markedly reduced. We know how to fix healthcare, social services, and education. It's in the documentation. Look at it on the website. I think you'll be really impressed. In addition to that, Alberta will become an absolute magnet for investment in this province. The boom times are coming again, just like they were in the late 70s, just prior to the national energy policy, when Alberta was becoming the center of economic power in Canada. And by the way, that NEP, that national energy policy, was very significantly designed to prevent Alberta from becoming the economic center of power in Canada. And it was also designed to use Alberta's wealth to buy Quebec's loyalty to Canada. But in any case, the prizes for independence are spectacular, and Alberta literally overnight, as an independent nation, would become the #1 GDP per capita nation in the world with the lowest taxation. And I'm excited about the future, not just for us, because this can happen while we're all still alive. It's not just for our kids and our grandkids, it's for us as well. And I think that's really important to understand. So, what do we need you to think about? Well, we'd like you to consider becoming a member. If you've got some time, you could become a volunteer or maybe even a chapter leader. We'd like you also to consider signing the petition for a referendum on independence, because that could occur sooner rather than later as well, depending on the numbers that we get. And finally, I got two more comments. One, ladies and gentlemen, honestly, freedom is not free. And you cannot have prosperity without freedom. And finally, as I used to teach my residents training in cardiac surgery, there are 3 kinds of people in this world: those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who wonder what the heck happened. So please help us make things happen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dennis. Just a reminder that we have these little cards. Write your questions on there. Put your hand up if you have one. And somebody will come and get it from you. Okay. And if you know somebody that can fix this music stand, that would be good too. Okay, our next presentation. This young man is from Lloydminster, Alberta. He is a brilliant industrial organization economist and a published author. He is a speaker and commentator on political and ethical issues and has studied under some of Canada's foremost economists. With his keen interest, wit, and bright mind, he offers so much perspective to the Alberta Prosperity Project, and he is here today to demonstrate the many merits and benefits of a free and prosperous Alberta. He is also our acting VP of Economics. He cares deeply about the state that Alberta finds herself in and about how intrusively our governments meddle in our economy in order to facilitate our ruin. Here with an economic forecast for the independent nation of Alberta, Mr. Tanner Hnidey.
Oh, no. I would move this, but I'm worried it'll break. And unlike Dr. Modry, I can't remember speeches to save my life. So we've heard Dr. Wagner talk about the history of independence. And we've heard Dr. Modry talk about the process to achieve independence. And now you'll hear from me, who is not a doctor, to talk about perhaps one of the consequences of independence. So when I graduated from university and was exhausted out of the educational system, extenuating circumstances called COVID, at least in part, impaired my ability to procure a job. So I decided to, at least for a little while, employ my Class 1 that I had obtained it right out of high school. And I said to myself, I'll hook up some Super Bs and I'll go haul some grain. And so that's what I did. And so, like every farmer, I would overload the semi, and then I would hammer on that sucker to get to the elevator before the DOT found and the scales opened up. And then I would unload the grain at the elevator, of course. I would pull out of the elevator. I would return to the field or to the bin. And then I would repeat the process. And as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. Of course, that is not the end of it. As the terminal approaches capacity, the grain is evacuated from the elevator and it's transported, as you know, onto train. And then from the train, it's moved and it's shipped all over the world. Some travels to America, more still travels to other provinces in Canada, but a vast selection of, the cereals and the canola is destined for Vancouver, for the ports, to then be traded and transferred and loaded and shipped all over the world for delivery in Japan, China, Indonesia, and so on, other importing countries. The wheat production alone in Canada is so prodigious that our export of wheat, $7 billion plus every year, ranks second largest in the world. And of course, you also know that our canola exports rank first largest in the world. So it's therefore unsurprising that a gentleman at one of our previous events inquired about an independent Alberta's opportunity to ship grain across the oceans. 90+% of Alberta's transactions are with our neighbors to the south, he said. And he's quite right. He's correct. However, he continued, he said that statistic does not apply to commodities like grain. And again, he's quite right, he's quite correct. We do trade grain with America, but not to the capacity that we do with other countries. What then, he asked. Do our prospects look like for trading commodities in an Alberta independent? And the question is welcome. One, because we farm a lot of acres, and two, because from the very beginning, Alberta's independence has been subject to undeserving opposition in the eyes of many, doomed to fail, precisely because they say we would forfeit our access to port. So Canada, they tremble, could lock us in from the outside and they would maroon us, so to say, and we'd be powerless and deserted, exposed to Ottawa and to their command over this expansive and diverse landscape and geography and ports. What then, men and women ask, could we do? But to be honest, I actually think that's framing the question wrong. The question, in my opinion, is not what would we, Alberta, do, but rather, what would they, the Canadian Parliament, do? I say this because I am presently thinking of the Laurentian, and I am thinking of what the Laurentian might be thinking when Alberta's independence is charging forward on a cavalry of a successful referendum. And I think I know what the Laurentian will be thinking. I think he will be thinking this. For 116 years, we have taken from Alberta all that she is worth, and we have captured her resources and her impressive capacity to generate wealth for our advantage, while ever ensuring her people were never permitted to change the apparatus of the Constitution. Alberta is our economic lifeblood. Alberta is our economic engine. What then will we do when Alberta becomes independent? I want to also note that an independent Alberta would look to Canada as its neighbors. We would look to them as our friends. And it is for that reason the APP is advocating for the most amiable, friendly, and beneficial relationship between the two nations in order to generate the highest level of prosperity, the greatest production of wealth, and the most impressive quantities of freedom, both for all of the people in Canada and all of our people here in Alberta as well. But let us suppose, just for the purposes of this speech, that Canada replied to our independence with trade restrictions, regulations, and rules which choke off our access to port. I do not believe this threat is credible. I do not even know if this threat will be uttered. But hypothetically, suppose it happened. Let there be no confusion. An independent Alberta could counter. An independent Alberta would counter, because we would no longer be pushed around by an Eastern elite. We would no longer be bullied by a federal parliament, and we would no longer be economically oppressed by opposition in the House of Commons. We could, and we would counter, because, as Dr. Modry has already so plainly put it, we would be wielding a tool more powerful and persuasive than anything we've wielded before. In fact, right now we wield nothing. But a successful referendum on independence is a mighty hammer, which grants us leverage, economic leverage. I mean this firstly with oil, and which some will say that's a typical answer. Perhaps, but it's true and it's legitimate. As we've already heard, from Alberta comes oil. From Alberta comes 98% of Canada's oil. And so, from the nexus in Edmonton and in Hardisty, right close, is an intricate web of a network of pipelines that transport oil all over the country and continent. Trans Mountain, oil is moved from Alberta to Burnaby and other refineries as well, but I'm particularly here with Burnaby, where it's refined to be utilized for jet fuel in Vancouver's airport. Oil is also moved to Regina, then to Chicago, where it's devoured in massive quantities by huge refineries in the Midwest. And finally, oil is moved back to Toronto, and then, yes, to Quebec and Montreal to satisfy their appetite to refine oil as well. And so we already know that leverage is available to us when independent. Here is a scenario. Eastern Canada denies our access to ports, and so we deny their access to our oil. Which, considering that Quebec refines 372,000 barrels of oil per day, Ontario refines 408,000 barrels of oil per day, BC refines 67,000 barrels of oil per day, and Saskatchewan refines 157,000 barrels of oil per day. That is not an insignificant response. Turning off the taps is credible. But secondly, we cannot dismiss the reality of negotiation. If you are courageous, and if you dare, and if you have a stomach of steel, listen to the news and to the mainstream media, and you will be fed a narrative of independence. It will, however, be a false narrative about independence. The news will arm itself with every deception to frighten and to scare us back into submission to the fist of the federal government. And so they will say that we are pursuing independence by the seat of our pants. They will introduce any and all uncertainty that they can in order to flood your mind and mine with fears and worries that in fact do not exist at all. You read our proposed timeline for independence, as Dr. Modry has already described, and you will see there a period post-referendum where we negotiate with the federal government for 6 to 12 months. I mean Alberta. And so every detail will be ironed out, every avenue explored. Every piece of relevant information will be cataloged and recorded so that if the federal government rejects our demands, we will know precisely what will happen post-independence. Nothing will surprise us. And that includes this situation with the oceans, which leads us to the final point, the ports themselves. As important as ports are to Alberta, and they are important, they are most probably more important to Canada. Here are a few numbers to demonstrate what I mean. Nearly 100% of all Asian manufactured vehicle imports, Kia, Mazda, Honda, Subaru, Toyota, destined for the Canadian market, arrive at the Vancouver port first. Shipping containers filled with TVs and steak and computers, dry freight, really anything you can imagine, are offloaded and unloaded and loaded up at the Vancouver port. Canadian wood pulp and paper, lumber, panel products, cargo, steel, machinery, all of these things flow through the Vancouver port. And finally, of course, there is grain. Richardson, Cargill, G3, and so on, all handle impressive terminals in Vancouver to ship your product overseas or to whichever market it needs to go. So in this, the Vancouver port enables a trade, or the trade, of approximately $240 billion in goods every year. More than 170 economies are acquainted with that port, with that dock, which means that Canada earns some $12 billion annually in GDP from that port alone, to which we also say, if Canada had the bravado to block our access to port, Alberta would have every reason to respond by saying, fine, we're going to put a tariff on every single good that passes through our province. And if they still won't open up the ports for us, then we would also have every right to say, fine, not one single good will pass through our province until we can get our grain to market. Finally, let me please remind you, I do not see any reason for this situation to come to pass. We are friends with Canada, not enemies. And mutually beneficial trade is exactly that. It's mutually beneficial. And so to that end, I must exclaim how excited I am for an independent Alberta and Canada to economically enjoy each other's goods, recognize each other's skills and industry, and trade together in freedom, in prosperity, and in peace. Thank you.
Yep. Question and answers time. I do have to recommend that you do work on your penmanship. Coming up. Boy. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. Here it is.
Whatever you'd like.
Let's get this out of the way. You guys can all sit together. We have to share.
Yeah, well, that's okay.
This one will work.
You're the
And This one will work. This one should work. Give Tanner that one.
Okay.
Oh, thank
And I'll give this one to you. You and I might have to share. Okay, so this should go pretty quickly because everybody has their own microphone and they won't have to fight over them. Dennis does like to take the microphone and not give it back, however. If we turn off the taps, can the federal government just buy oil from Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, that's true. The federal government can buy oil from Saudi Arabia, and that's what they're doing now, and that's what they intend to do when they shutter our oil and gas industry. But there are many other markets out there for our oil and gas.
And I would also add that Saudi's oil is, well, of course, Saudi Arabia has an incredible amount of oil, it's true, but it's not the same oil that we have. Actually, the blessing of our specific grade of oil, this heavy sour oil, is that you can make so many products, as Dennis mentioned, from it, because you can refine it. You see, it's one thing to import a lot of light oil, and that's nice for some things, but with heavy, you can transform it and you can refine it to what you want it to be for asphalt or whatever else it might have you. Not only so, but it really is, it's so much cheaper to import or to ship oil through the country through a pipeline than it is to import it by freighter or by ship. It's really unbelievable that we're doing so now. So to an extent, perhaps they could buy from Saudi, but logistically, no. I don't, yeah. Dennis is correct. You could, but you also can't, just because of the differences. Yeah. So economists have a terrible tendency to go on the one hand, and then they go on the other hand, and there's so many hands. So I wouldn't worry about that at all.
So if you're confused, I know I'm confused now.
What is the plan for engaging our youth? So we do have one youth leader. She's established. She's from Athabasca. She's actually one of our guest speakers as well. And she spoke in both Athabasca and Westlock, and she did a phenomenal job. She's 22 years old. Her name is Miranda Wager, and she's going places.
I would just add to that what we're intending on doing is setting up educational chapters in colleges and universities. That's one thing. Second, a lot of young people these days are observing, social media, and particularly TikTok and Instagram, YouTube. And as a consequence, we are targeting, much of our educational material. So when you're engaging somebody in a discussion, whether it's a young person or an older person, it doesn't really matter the age, is you need to sort of figure out where they're at. What do you want? As a young person starting out, and they're maybe starting out in a job, ask them the question, how much of your tax dollars that you make would you like to go to the federal government? And see what they have to say. My wife's daughter, when I asked her that question, she looked at me and she said, nothing. None of it. I don't want any of my money going to the tax department. Well, of course, that's unrealistic, but how about 10% versus 50 or 60%? Because what's coming as a result of the debt that we have is there are already people paying at a tax rate of 70% when you add everything up. So that's really unconscionable. So, we need to target everybody. And one of the things that you can ask people is, along these lines is, what would you want if you knew what you can have? And then you can engage them. The biggest challenge in all of this is engaging people and then talking to them about their freedoms and prosperity.
What is your plan to explain to our municipal leaders how following the path of the Alberta Prosperity Project will benefit our communities?
That's a really good question. In terms of municipal leadership, the thing is that here's the way people can benefit. Right now, I mentioned earlier No, I didn't ask this question earlier. But how many people here own their home without a mortgage? Okay, so if you think you own your home, just don't pay your taxes and you'll find out who owns your home, right? So from a municipal perspective, what we know from an economic point of view, the retention of all of our wealth and future investment, eventually we could get to the point where you actually own your home without having to pay property taxes, in which case, for the first time ever, you will then truly own your home, because right now, people do not really have property rights. So from a municipal perspective, there will definitely have to be a tax base. And from that tax base, municipal services get looked after. Now, in any larger municipality, and I think some of the hamlets and smaller villages might have to be thought of differently, but if you want to build a new road in a town or in a city, or you want to build an amphitheater of some sort, then the way you can do that is you can ask the taxpayer if they want that through a referendum. And if they do, then your flat 10% tax goes to 12% for a year and a half or two until that expenditure is met, and then it goes back down. And so because we're all individuals, towns are individual, villages are individual, cities, etc., are individual. And so why should Coronation pay for something to be built in Calgary or Edmonton? It doesn't make sense, does it? So in other words, what I'm saying is decentralized control for the municipalities to look after their affairs with their tax dollars without having the burden of looking after everybody else, particularly in the major cities. There's a lot that can be done here to benefit people in ways in which you've never even thought of before. And I think when you look at the website and you go to the economic section, you'll see some of this in there. And obviously there's more to come.
Let's hurry up and get out of this mess they're keeping us in. Speed it up, please. Let's not repeat what happened in the 1970s. Nothing happened. Could you explain the timeline?
Yeah, the timeline. Well, let's see. We've spent 116 years not getting out of Dodge. Do we want to spend another 116 years? No. We don't have that much time. And one of the things that I neglected to mention is, for example, constitutional battles don't take months and years to resolve. They take decades to resolve. And since we know what the agenda is in 2030 by the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, let's get this done to begin with in 2023. Here's the timeline. 2023, you elect an independence-focused government. You take control of those 5 things that I mentioned. You have your referendum on independence anytime after the election, but up until 30 months. So you've set the stage, though. If you can take control of those 5 things within the Constitution, you're really ready to go now. And then you have that referendum, so 2023, so 2025, between 2025 and 2026, you have the referendum. You negotiate for 6 to 12 months. And at that point, you're 2026 to 2027, we're out. That's the timeline. And it doesn't have to be any longer than that. But the key is what you folks do, and how many each, just think, if each one of you can bring 10 people into this conversation and they buy into this argument and this path forward, then we win. Because remember, ladies and gentlemen, if not what we're advocating, which has never been done before, what else is there? What else can bring about the protection of your individual rights and your prosperity and self-determination? There is nothing else. And we know the downhill spiral that we're on now. So let's just make it happen.
Will our currency stay the same?
Finally. I could answer this, but I'm going to let Tanner do this one.
No. So I am in favor of a gold standard. The reason being, of course, is because we're dealing with this hydra of inflation that for every percentage point the bank seems to try and knock down, 2 more percentage points take its place. Because, of course, the federal government has simply printed too much money too quickly. But the question, the problem is if tomorrow, frighteningly, I was granted dictatorial power over the rest of Alberta, and I said, we're going on a gold standard. You might well, because we're not in a crisis or a war, have a panic, a large panic, and people, just by their nature, would be frightened, and so they'd head to the bank and pull their cash out and so on, and it would be a problem, and that's not what we want. So the question is, how do you try and transition to a system where government no longer has a monopoly on money, because that's the problem, without causing mass panic? That's the question. Instead of forcing a man to jump off the cliff and plunge into this new currency system, we want him to take a slide, right? Something nice and easy and relaxing. One of the ways to possibly do so that we're considering and working out is what's known as a free currency system, a free banking system, or a parallel gold standard. So in a 1-minute oversimplified view, it might look like this. We have a referendum on independence. We gain our independence after. Post-independence, there's nothing that states we cannot, for the moment, continue to use the Canadian currency while we transition. As we're doing that, you could start by creating a separate Alberta currency. Perhaps we'd call them Ralph bucks. And then on one day, we would say, okay, it's been so-and-so amount of time, it's time to switch. And the official currency of Alberta is now this Klein buck. What's important is that you constitutionally enshrine rules and regulations that ensure inflation and other problems can't arise again. One of those, of course, is that the government can't print dollars at their wit and at their whim. It has to be regulated. But what's more important, in my opinion, is that as you're setting up that new banking system, you also allow private banks to print their own currency. What might be that there is a bank which springs up that says, we back all of your earnings in gold. It's a gold-backed bank. And we issue our own currency, like a gold-backed debit card. And so if I wanted to go to a grocery store in this new Alberta and pay either with a Klein buck or with gold, I could do so. You see, what it does is it gives the individual, the consumer, choice. If you think inflation is a problem, as I do, then you can transfer your savings and your wealth into gold or some other thing, whatever else a private bank wants to create. If, on the other hand, you have no problem with the way that a fiat currency is running, then there's nothing that's stopping you from keeping your earnings in that fiat currency. And so what it does is it smooths out the transition, so to say, and it introduces competition into the currency market so that government's monopoly on money, which has gotten us to where we are today, is eradicated. And that's it.
There has been talk about credit unions and the Alberta Treasury branch. Can you explain how the banking system will work?
Well, I'll start this one off. One of the things that we would do, and this is part of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. I only had so much time to speak before, so I'm glad I can add this in. So part of the Alberta Sovereignty Act is that what we would do is put in new legislation or implement new legislation that would provide a new regulatory framework around ATB and the credit unions. In other words, banking institutions that are housed in Alberta, in which case that legislation would get them out from under any federal regulatory authority. And why that's relevant is because it will then protect all of you and all Albertans from CRA and the federal government.
I would agree that the point is government cannot be allowed to tell the banks what to do. And this is what I'm telling you now is objective. This isn't political or partisan in any way. What the Liberal government and Mr. Trudeau did in literally a day by freezing assets and accounts is going to have repercussions for decades to come, because nobody knows if their investments, their assets, their savings are secure. And so they can't properly analyze the risk of certain investments or savings and so on. And it leads to what we call, it's called regulatory holdup. It's this issue of uncertainty in the market where there shouldn't be uncertainty or uncertainty to this extent. And so Dr. Modry answered it perfectly. You have a system where individuals' accounts are protected from government intervention.
If the digital ID and other undesirable policies have been implemented prior to becoming independent, how hard will it be to reverse this damage once we are independent? Will they automatically be abolished?
Yeah, absolutely. They would be abolished into the fire of you know where. Yeah, there'd be no reason to contemplate saving anything. I mean, even many of the federal politicians that are running to lead the Conservative Party, the federal Conservative Party, are speaking out against the Great Reset and the digital ID. I, for the life of me, can't understand why Kenny would even, our Premier, would even want to trial implementing a digital ID in the province of Alberta. But that tells you the direction we're going, and we need, obviously, to do something about it, and that's what we are all about.
I feel that there are a few grassroots groups starting, such as the Alberta Prosperity Project. We need to be one strong voice for the betterment of Alberta. Do you have a plan to unite all of those groups?
You bet. In fact, we've had a number of meetings with the various independence organizations, as well as the independence parties, as well as many of the disaffected UCP MLAs. So, exactly how this gets navigated in the future is going to be a little bit dependent on what happens on May the 18th with the final result of the vote on Kenny's leadership. And I think that'll be quite interesting. But yes, the reality is we're taking the various organizations, such as the Freedom or Free Alberta Strategy, Project Confederation, Take Back Alberta, Take Back Our Freedoms, Alberta 51. We're having discussions with all of these, and we don't need to come together as one unit. What we need is for all of them to be getting out the same message, and that is the message of Alberta independence and the need for leverage. And if they can all come together that way from an organizational perspective, we win. And then if we can align all of the independent-oriented parties, that's a bonus. And what you will be able to do, because of what we are able to do, we will have, for example, at some point on our website, a grid, and it will have the various parties on the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis what they're prepared to do, and with a box, and we'll be able to check the box, and you will know immediately from an educational perspective which parties will best protect your interests, your individual freedoms and rights, your prosperity and your self-determination. It'll become self-evident, and then you will know come the 2023 election who you want to vote for.
The next question is about when are our next events. So tomorrow we're in Camrose at 2 o'clock. The doors open at noon. On the 13th of May, we go to Drayton Valley. 14th, we're in Grand Prairie. 15th, we're in Whitecourt. Then we don't have anything going on the long weekend, unless anybody has a good idea. Spruce View on the 27th, Airdrie the 28th, Calgary on the 29th, Tofield on the 3rd, and Pinoka on the 5th. So we got a long ways to go to get this message out, but we are going to give it a valiant effort. Oh, okay. This question kind of caught me a little bit off guard, but I'll ask it. What are you going to do about stopping the sex trafficking in Alberta? We are the highest in North America.
No, that's the first time that question's been posed. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't know that Alberta was the highest trafficked area. But what we're really talking about is the trafficking of young people, young girls and young boys. And all I can say is that when we have our own Alberta Provincial Police Force, we would advocate for doing everything we can to stop it, period.
Who do we vote for to champion this initiative?
Well, I'll try and answer the question. I thought I did answer the question, but I'll answer it differently. Simply ask your MLA candidates if they will, or what they will do different in the last 116 years that hasn't been done before to protect my interests, my individual freedoms and rights, my prosperity and my self-determination. You MLA candidate, you tell me what you're going to do. You political party, you tell me what you're going to do. And if they don't have an answer, don't vote for them. That's number one. Number two, if they do have an answer, but it doesn't take them to stating that they will advocate for holding a successful referendum on independence, you know that the emperor has no clothes, because it's not possible without that leverage, that successful referendum on independence. That's how to figure it out. It really isn't that complicated. You know, it kind of gets to the point of saying, you know, we've thought about this a lot, and as an individual voter, you say to yourself, well, what's in it for me? If I'm going to vote for you, what's in it for me? Well, you know what's in it for you. Your individual freedoms and rights, your prosperity, your self-determination, right? That's what's in it for you. But you've got to be able to have the courage to ask the question of these people, or at least get to the website, APP website, and follow along with what these parties are stating that they will do. But you're going to have somebody knock on your door or give you a flyer, or somebody's going to get your attention. Ask them the question. Ask them the questions, the important questions that each of you find most important. And I would bet that most of you would want your individual freedoms and rights protected, your prosperity protected, your self-determination protected, whatever order that might be. And there are other things as well, but I'm pretty sure that most people want those things protected. And if there's no referendum on independence, that means they have no idea about leverage. I could tell you another story that's kind of cute, but time is wasting. But
See what I mean? He gets the microphone, he won't give it back. What has the Alberta Prosperity Project proposed in terms of getting our school systems back on track?
well, that's a simple one. Because right now, parents have lost control of the education system. And the simple way to get control of the educational system is that each student has a voucher from the government, and they can go wherever they want, to the public school system, to the private school system, to a charter school system. And in so doing, that generates performance at every level, because each school system is going to want that child to come to that school. And if they're not performing at a high level, and if they haven't eliminated this crap on critical race theory and wokeness and cancel culture and all that baloney, then, sorry, I didn't mean to be that strong. But really, it's follow the money. And if the government gives you the money, I mean, it's your money anyhow, so you get a voucher, and you know, it's follow the money will follow the student, and the school systems will respond to the money.
What is your plan for the Alberta Health Services? Fixing it.
Well, just in a couple of things I can say about this, since I've worked in the system for so long. Right now, the Alberta Health Services functions in the lowest quartile as a measured metric around the world, and our cost is in the highest quartile. So obviously, there's something wrong with the system. And I wrote a paper for Ralph Klein and Caucus, which was a background document for Don Mazankowski's health report. It was entitled, the one I drafted was Medicare is Killing Us, Reengineering the Canadian Healthcare System. And all I can tell you is that at every level of healthcare, from management to patients, each one of you, not necessarily each one of you, but there are problems with the way the system operates, and it can be so much more efficient. And I'm just going to give you one example that, but it's representative of the inefficiency of the whole system. So when I would be operating on people, we'd do an open heart case in the morning and one in the afternoon in general. And between cases, it would take about an hour and a half to change over, from the time that the first patient left the operating room until the next patient was in and the incision was made. So we were wondering about why it took so long, so a bunch of us went to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. And what we saw there was quite amazing. From the time that at Cedars-Sinai that the first patient left the operating room and the next patient came in and the incision was made was roughly about 3 minutes. Now, how did they do that? Well, they did that this way. They had, as soon as the patient left the operating room, there was a team that came in, removed any of the disposables, cleaned things, and then the next patient, who was already anesthetized, prepped, and draped, was rolled into the operating room, and the new cardiac surgical team came in and started operating. That's how they did it. It was pretty efficient. When I was at Stanford one day, I was about 20 minutes late because I was caught dealing with an issue in the intensive care unit. And when I got to the operating room, the head nurse absolutely reamed me out because I was 20 minutes late. And she said to me, do you realize that you've cost this patient, like, some thousands of dollars because there was 20 minutes of time. So time is money. And I got to tell you, in the way the system operates, the amount of time that is wasted is unconscionable. And those are your tax dollars. I can assure you that we could have a far better and more efficient system if we could get out from under the oppression of the Canada Health Act, which prevents creativity and innovation in the delivery of healthcare. So yeah, anybody want to stay for 3 or 4 more hours? I can tell you a lot about the healthcare system.
Next question has to do with chapters and memberships. I think that the memberships that are input is up to 4,300, just a little bit over 4,300, and we still have volunteers working on getting 4,578 without the unentered ones. 4,578. I stand corrected. Anyway,
but we just started, remember, on February the 18th. See how I can get the mic from her?
4,578 memberships since the 21st of February. That's what we've got. So also since the 21st of February, we have started these chapters. So from February the 21st till the end of March, we had created 43 chapters. From at the end of April, we had 118, and yesterday when I counted, we had 122. So we're growing daily, just about daily. We had a volunteer seminar online last Thursday, 2 Thursdays ago, and there was 157 people on that call to start, and we ended that call with 143 potential volunteers, including chapter leaders. We have 43 people already on the list wanting to open a chapter or start a chapter in their community, and we will get to 300 before we're, hopefully by the end of June. It's doable, and we're working really hard on that. So what's a chapter, you say? Well, we grew so quickly in that little bit of time that we had to divide the province into 7 regions because there was that many people that wanted to have all of the information that we have available. And in this room today, there are 3 of those regional leaders. Shauna Krubbish is your regional leader for Central East. She's over here. Pam Koenig is the regional leader for Central West, all the way to the BC border. And Jason Lemieux looks after the merchandise, and he looks after all of the South. So Calgary and surrounding area, and south to the Montana border, and all the way to Saskatchewan border. I mean, there's other ones as well for the North and everything else, but that's how quickly we grew. So we needed to have all of those things in place. So anyways, if you want to start a chapter, go talk to one of those guys. They know what to do. My next question is, how many people here have a membership already for the Alberta Prosperity Project? Wow. Super. How many people are going to leave here without one? Okay, last question. How would immigration be handled?
Well, if you go back in time, we're all descendants of immigrants, right? So fundamentally, a booming economy is going to attract people. So immigration is looming large in an independent nation. But we need to be smart about it, not dumb like what's happening at the southern border in the US. So business needs to play an important role in immigration, meaning that when business is growing, and it will be growing, and it will be growing massively, it's going to need employees. It's going to need people with specific skill sets that may not be available by the population in Alberta at that particular time. And so merit-based immigration is going to be extremely valuable for us. So immigration is definitely something that, you know, we would support. What we don't support is open borders, and we don't support chain link immigration either.
Okay. That's all the questions that I have. So I'm just going to leave you with some closing remarks. Maybe I'm not.
I knew I'd think of something. I want you to think about this. You know, if we come together, like I said, when we come together and we save this amazing province, we will actually set an example for other provinces to save themselves as well. And in so doing, save much of the rest of Canada.
So as I've said, thousands of people have heard our message. Stop it. People from every province and every walk of life. And this is just the beginning. We are building a strong foundation. We need all of you to join us. We need you to leave this event and be excited about what you've heard here. We need you to bring freedom and prosperity in and take it into your own hands and bring it into your own communities. We need to grow this community. We need to grow this movement, this growing wave of Albertans who have had enough. This is a people's movement, and it cannot move without all of you. There is strength in numbers, and Alberta will not be free without those numbers. We've got one chance to secure a future for our children and our grandchildren. One chance, and that's
electing an independent-minded government in 2023. If you don't think it's important to the little kids, my granddaughter was at the event in Medicine Hat. She's only 8. And at the break, she came up behind me and she pulled on my shirt and she whispered something in my ear and she ran back and sat in her seat. Then on the way home, she said to me, because there was a lot of people around me, she said, "Grandma, were all of those people wanting to become members of the Alberta Prosperity Project?" And I said, "Some of them were." And she said, "I hope they all do, because that's how we're going to win." We need people with vision. We need people with ideas. So please, buy a membership. Become a chapter leader. Become a volunteer. Create an event in your community that will bring people together. Our group in the north, the regional leaders from Region 7 are at a trade expo today, talking about prosperity gardens. It's a way to share the produce from your garden with your community. It's 100% doable, very easy. You can leave here with some rack cards. You can leave here with some petitions. You can leave here with extra memberships if you want, or you can direct people to our website. We need to show our friends and our neighbors that there is hope. We need you to be the change that you want to see in the world. You need to talk to your friends and neighbors and encourage them to come to an event at the very least, or watch it online. We're on YouTube, we're on Rumble, we've got podcasts. We have all the stuff and all the things to get this done. Our message is strong and the community is growing. A true community doesn't mean that you are geographically close to someone or in the same social network. It's about feeling connected, and that's what we've been missing. Alberta is our ultimate community, and everyone here can play a crucial role. We must become bigger than we have ever been, stronger in spirit, larger in outlook, and we must restore our communities, owing our ultimate allegiance not to the government, but to each other. Alberta will become a sovereign constitutional republic, one where the First Nations people sit at the table as partners in the creation of the new nation of Alberta. And on that great day, Alberta truly will become united, strong, and free. Thank you. Good work, boys. You're dismissed. Yeah.
Sorry. I've lost course.
Me too. With me too?
Who's going where?
Me? With my 3 microphones. Proud if I sit you down there, so I just thought I'd throw that out there.
No, it was fine. It was fine. Yeah, I mean, you just do such a great job of